Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second session of the second International Legal and Policy Conference on the Future of Transport, Fall or Rise of Transport, conducted by Aerospace and Aviation Lawyers Association of India in collaboration with Center for Aerospace and Defense Laws, Nalsar University of Law and Lecturerites. In this session, the topic will be transport and environment, the special case of aviation. Today, as our panelists, we have Mr. Yu Huang from International Air Transport Association, Mr. Fredrik Ramfe from Swedish Aviation Industry Group, Mr. Anish Michael from Ola Mobility Institute. The session will be moderated by Mr. Saeed Tamjid Ahmad from Spavia Tech Law. Now I invite Saeed sir to commence the session.
Thank you, thank you, Arun, for this introduction. And
welcome.
Hi, Frederick. Hi, Anush. And hi, Miss Yu. I'm here. And as the topic suggests, we'll be discussing on the topic of environment and aviation. And I won't take much of the time for myself because I'm the moderator, and I will let the speakers put across their thoughts. But as we know that in the recent years, aviation has been at the hitting end of this entire thing, where aviation has been shamed, aviation has been blamed, and for causing a lot of environmental issues. Now, it has certain scientific aspect, it has certain regulatory aspect. Obviously, here we are concerned with the regulatory aspect and how the regulations and the policy can deal with this issue which has come up now, and how we can manage this for a better and more sustained aviation in the future. So I will now open the floor for the first speaker, which is Miss Yu Huang. So, ma'am, you may start with your presentation.
So thank you very much for your kind introduction, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm Huang Yue from IATA. I'm dealing with all those policy issues linking with the environment, aviation, and also sustainability issues. So I'm very much grateful to join the panel today and discuss with you and other panelists of those topics. So in my session, I will provide you a high-level overview on the aviation industry's most recent pledge to the climate change, and also what are the proposed pathways to achieve the goal. Then I would highlight some of the associated legal and policy framework that would support the industry to achieve this goal, and also what kind of challenges we're currently faced. So I'll build up my presentation around those structures, and then later we can having those in-depth discussion. So to start with, I'd like to show you this slide, and basically to highlight the state of play currently. So simply where we are today, and also what are the pathways that would help the industry to achieve the proposed mid and long-term goal. Maybe before we dive into the chart, and I will provide you some background, and then will better help us to illustrate those information listed here on the chart. So back in 2009, actually, the whole aviation industry, here I'm not talking about only airlines, but also the airports, aircraft manufacturers, OEMs, and also the air navigation service providers. So the whole supply chain of the aviation industry, and of course, plus the airline themselves, they come together and committed 3 climate change goals. The first goal is known as the fuel efficiency goal, and that one is to achieve 1.5 average fuel efficiency improvement from 2009 to 2020. And here you can see this pledge reflected in the chart here. It's the red part here. So the part between the red dash line and the solid blue line at the bottom. So those are the emission reductions the industry have achieved because of the fuel efficiency. So IATA will also monitor how the fuel efficiency year per year, and our monitor data shows that actually the industry performed much better than 1.2% the improvement as proposed by the goal per year, but the actual fuel efficiency we achieve is around 2% per year. Of course, that's before COVID crisis. And this is because of those renewing of the aircraft of generation, because each of the new generation of the aircraft will generate 10 to 15% of the fuel efficiency. So this portion of emission reductions are largely gained through those parts. And the second goal of the industry back then is to achieve the carbon neutral growth from 2020. And in the graph here, you can see this gray part that reflects the industry will offset all those additional emissions, which is above the baseline level. And by its essence, what does offsetting mean is that under one mechanism, and here to put things into perspective, we are referring to the CORSIA. Some of you might be heard of it, but for those ones who are not hear it at all, it means the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. So the essence of the scheme is it is the first market-based measures for the international aviation emissions and for all the emissions above this baseline level. So in this scheme, the proposed baseline is the average emission of 2019 and 2020. Later, we'll have deeper dive into this change of the baselines. But all the emissions are above this baseline for the airlines as obliged parties under the scheme, they will go to the carbon market and purchase those CORSIA eligible emission units to offset the part above the baseline so that the carbon neutral growth goal can be achieved. So this is the second goal. And the third goal is known as a long-term goal. And back then, the long-term goal industry set is to have the 2050 emission compared to its 2005 level. So in practice, what does this mean? We can see this blue square over here is triangle actually. So in practice, this means that from 2020 to 2050, the industry shall reduce 18.6 gigatons of CO2. And then the question comes, as Sai just highlighted, we're currently facing a lot of the shame of flying or the pressures, but more importantly, as an industry, we want to secure our sustainable development pathways and also facing the imminent climate change associated perils. The question comes like, if the industry can step up its effort and to declare or to set a more ambitious long-term goal. So in other words, whether net zero is possible, and then if yes, what's the additional emission reductions shall industry secure if industry want to meet net zero 2050? And we'll come to that question. We'll answer that question in the next slides, but before that, all those long-term goals will be achieved through a basket of measures, and you can see those kind of dark dots in this square. Like the first one is the technology, just as we mentioned, all those new generation of the aircraft are technologies, and also including the SAF, the sustainable aviation fuels, and those fuels will gradually replacing the fossil fuels, the conventional jet fuels that we're currently used today. So those are fall in the basket of technology, and also the operational measures, and those measures are typically those ones airlines deployed to reduce the weight on the cabin, or like those ones to retrofit the winglet so as to gain better fuel efficiencies. And also we can't ignore the contribution of infrastructures, and those are many to optimizing the utilization of the airspaces. So those kind of obligations are largely laid down on the air traffic management bodies. And also the last pillar is called market-based measures. Just now we mentioned CORSIA. So this is typical one of the market-based measures the industry now committed. So with all those practical measures, industry will see if we can achieve a more ambitious long-term goal. And the good news is yes, because in this year's IATA's General Assembly in October in Boston, so the members have committed to reach net zero emission by 2050. So in practice, that means we will achieve more of 2.6 gigatons of CO2 from 2021 to 2050. So within those 29 years. And by having this more ambitious goal, the industry believes that our goal is now stay in full alignment with the Paris Agreement temperature rise goal of 1.2 Celsius. And also we very much confirmed that this climate change issue is not about our sustainable development, but it's more about to take wider social responsibilities to ensure industry can keeping the benefit of this global connectivity for future generations. So the industry really take this very seriously. And then from this one, we can put into perspective of how those basket measures will play a role in helping industry to achieve the 2050 net zero goal. To put it simply, which measures will be playing a part to help the industry. So from this chart, from this table, what you can see is there for different type of operations in different years, different pathways will play a role, either heavier or mixed pathways. So we can see here the first message is there are indeed exciting opportunities for hydrogen and electric aircraft, but it is important also to look at which market segment those technologies could play a role. As you can see here, for the hydrogen and electric aircraft, it plays a heavier role in helping the regional and short-haul flight. But for the medium-haul and long-haul flight, of which kind of contribute most of the emissions of the aviation industry, the electric and hydrogen aircraft will be playing a very limited role, simply because the energy intensity of this aircraft cannot meet the operational level to support the medium and long-term haul flight. And for those type of flights, we see there are a lot of like purple SAF here. That means very simply, so SAF will do the heavy lifting in helping the medium haul and long-term haul flight to reach its emission reduction goal. We'll see the next slide over here. It's so we're just talking about the long-term goal and what pillars will play a role together to help industry to achieve the long-term goal. But here I'd like to bring you a step back and to look at what about the midterm goal and what is the legal framework that's supporting industry to meet this goal. We just briefly mentioned CORSIA already, and we also mentioned CORSIA, the current, I should not say current because it's changed, but when the mechanism come to the agreement in 2016, the agreed baseline is the average emission of 2019 and 2020. But because you can see this big V shape here, it means the international traffic drop caused by the COVID-19, and it happens in 2020. So if in that case, we still have the average of 2019 and 2020 at CORSIA's baseline, what would happen would it will bring this baseline all the way back to the level of 2005 level. So it's not carbon neutral growth from 2020 anymore, but carbon neutral growth from 2005. But industry has not committed that carbon neutral growth back then. So taking into account of this, and if we look at this gray part over here, the upper side means the upper side scenario for the industry's recovery, and lower part means the downside scenario. And we can see lots of uncertainties associated with the industry's recovery. So given such, we believe that it is important to have the CORSIA baseline adjusted and setting right in order to reflect the industry's ambitions back then, or the commitment back then when people agreed to join the scheme. So in the last year's ICAO Council, the Council agreed to change the original baseline of the average 2019 to 2020 to 2019 only, so as to reflect the proper commitment level. The reason I mention this case here is I think it will be interesting from the legal perspective. It is important to have this kind of safeguarding clause in the international framework to address the global emissions. Because should 2020 back into the equation to determine the baseline, that would deter states from joining CORSIA, therefore reduce its coverage and also the environment integrity. The last point I want to highlight here is a challenge. So we are currently in the phase whereby CORSIA will be implemented through states by transposing the CORSIA SARPs contained in Volume 4, Annex 16, Chicago Convention into their national legislation. But we see that the latest proposal from EU Fit for 55, there is one legislative proposal known as EU ETS revision, whereby we see EU failed to implement CORSIA for all international flights. And that would lead us back to the patchwork of those carbon price instruments to address international emission reductions from aviation industry. And we see that as a very severe challenge because all the patchwork will leading to higher cost, administrative cost, and burden to the airlines. And also that would impede the financial situation of the airlines further, and would also impede our programs to achieve the long-term goal by commercial deployment of SAF mainly. So there I'll leave my my remarks, and I'll give the floor to the next panelist, and I look forward to answer your questions and also the follow-up discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Yui, for this nice presentation and your entire discussion on this topic. And now we'll have, so just a pointer that the Q&A will be after the entire session is over. So any questions you have, you can write in the chat box and we will take them up once the entire panelist session is over. So Frederick, it's now your turn. Please feel free to start.
Thank you very much, Tamid. Just to check, so I can share my screen.
Yes, we can see that. Yeah.
So can you see now my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So first of all, a big thank you for having me in where I am in Stockholm. It's still dark. It's an early morning. I'm very happy to be able to discuss a few points on let's say, the measures to reach our goals, our ambitions, and also which kind of possibilities this might bring to the aviation industry with you. And one word about myself. So my name is Frederick Kempfe. I'm Director of Industry Affairs at the Swedish Aviation Industry Group, which is part of the bigger Confederation of Swedish Enterprises. We are both an industry body and also representing our members, which range from everything from Scandinavian airlines to smaller training facilities, for example, and maintenance companies. So basically the whole food chain of aviation as a member of our association. So I think the presentation we just heard from Sui was very elaborate and very clear. And I would like to take you into the Swedish context and a little bit of the European context. If I go to the next slide, clearly we have some challenges ahead. So I hope you see now a screen with a symbol where we really see the challenges ahead. We have the climate challenge, but not only that, we have the COVID challenge. We have an aviation system which is brought down to its knees. In many areas in the world, we are still struggling to get traffic going again. I fear that this will continue for a while, mainly because states fail to coordinate their actions, how to protect themselves or ourselves from COVID. And as long as this non-coordination continues, travel and certainly international travel will suffer. We also have an efficiency challenge. We are consuming more and more resources from this planet, and I think there's a challenge for every technology to become more efficient. And as Sui just mentioned, aviation is quite good at that, but we have to become even more efficient. And then there is a connectivity challenge. We have to connect societies, we have to connect within a country, regions. And we know how important this is for persons, for people, for families, for companies, for economies. So all of these challenges are on us right now, and we have to understand them well to be able to maneuver. if we look at the Swedish picture, we decided, our government, our parliament decided that Sweden will become one of the world's first nations to go 100% fossil fuel free. To speed up the development, and basically the magic number here is 2045. And this was already some years ago. And to speed up the development, to engage the industry, a program which is called Fossil Free Sweden was created. And if you see a purple, it should be let's say a leaflet on the right side of the screen. This is what this initiative has created. It has created roadmaps for fossil-free competitiveness. So basically, every industry sector in Sweden have created their own roadmaps how to reach fossil-free activities or business before or at 2045. And this is, I think, over around 30 of these roadmaps now, or even more, because there are basically one more every month coming out. And if we go to aviation, so we created our own fossil-free roadmap, which was presented in 2018. And for anyone interested, I would be happy to provide you with information. There is an English short version as well. And as you can see on the screen, we have two goals. 2030, all flights in Sweden, domestic flights, shall be fossil free. And by 2045, since we have to meet the Swedish ambition, all flights originating from Sweden shall be fossil free, meaning the volumes of fuel tanked into these flights should be then from sustainable aviation fuel, or of course other means, if we then have the technology such as electrification, such as hydrogen. So there we have the Swedish picture, and this is what we're working with every day. We mentioned already that, of course, there has to be some policy instruments here to help, to persuade, but I hope also to help the industry to transform. In Sweden, we have introduced a number of measures. In 2018, an aviation tax was introduced. And this year, a reduction mandate for fossil-free fuel, for sustainable aviation fuel, was introduced. So it started to tick now, if you wish. And from January next year, so in a few days, we have climate differentiated airport fees at two of our main airports, Stockholm and Gothenburg. And in the pipeline, the government, in its wisdom, have also two other proposals. One is airport congestion related fees to remove congestion, or at least with a purpose to remove congestion on especially Arlanda, Stockholm Airport, and then also climate declaration for longer transports. So the passenger, the customer, should receive a climate declaration from longer transport. They will start with aviation, but the intention is to then move on to other forms of transport as well. So that's the Swedish picture right now. But then we have the EU, which during this year has really formed itself, as was already mentioned, when it comes to climate change and to beat the climate change. And the ambition is that Europe should be the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. And under that grand plan, we have the 2030 climate target plan. And that's when we see the expression fit for 55. That's not the go to the gym when you're 55 ambition, which of course should be good as well. But I will show you now what fit for 55 is. So basically, we are talking about reduction of EU greenhouse gas emissions to 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. So that's the fit for 55 for you. And you can see that on this graph. So by 2030, there shall be a minus 55% of the emissions of CO2 that we had in 1990. So under this package, Fit for 55 package, I will show you on the next screen that we have a number of legislations that we are working with now. And some of them, let's say, affect us in the aviation industry immediately and some indirectly. So let me see if I can go to the next screen. Here you have the European Green Deal, reaching our 2030 climate targets. So there are a number of legislative measures here which are being cooked now. None of them, or some of them, are already valid or applicable, but they are now being strengthened, and some are not there yet. They are on proposals, and we have commented to the European Union, and we will see when and how they will be implemented and come into force. So with a magic touch here, you can see a number of round red circles, I hope, because if we start from the bottom there, this is where I see aviation is immediately affected. We have a legislative package called Refuel Aviation Initiative, which is a reduction mandate, let's say, on a bigger scale for SAF, for sustainable aviation fuel in Europe. We have the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, which attempts to make it easier for example, airports to introduce infrastructure for alternative fuels, both SAF or electricity or hydrogen eventually. We have the Renewable Energy Directive, which from the name you can imagine what this is. We have the Energy Efficiency Directive, which is also attempting to put clear ambitions on every sector to become more energy efficient. And then we have Energy Taxation Directive, which applies to all the member states, all 27, where we can see that the ban on taxating intra-EU aviation shall be removed gradually over a 10-year period. And then we have the EU emissions trading system, EU ETS, which was already mentioned by my colleague just before me. And this is then a proposal to strengthening the system to make it more efficient when it comes to reaching our 2030 climate targets. European aviation has not stood still for a second, as was already mentioned. Since 2009, and I would say even before that, aviation internationally, aviation in Europe has worked very hard on its to reduce its climate and also other environmental impacts. So this year, Destination 2050, a route to net zero European aviation was introduced. And this is how European aviation industry has formed itself through some very, very tough targets. And as you can see on the right side, you have the targets. So the reduction potential is very high, but there are a number of measures that we need. Not only new technologies, but certainly, as you might know, also in Europe, we have to be able to fly straight eventually and not circumventing the quickest route to save enormous amounts of fuel. So there are a number of measures that we can do and shall do, and we have to do to be able to meet the targets. Very, very quickly, it was already mentioned that we have a number of different technologies to help us reach these targets. Battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell, and sustainable fuels. And you already saw that beautiful table from my colleague, so I don't have to go into details, but I would like to mention at least that all of these measures are right now either being well off being prepared and put on market already. I mean, we are already fueling a little bit of SAF in our aircraft in Sweden, and there will be more eventually. But we also have a number of interesting companies in Europe and elsewhere which are now, well, developing the technology that we believe we need to transform to a sustainable industry. And if you see on the bottom side here, I would like to mention that this is will not only have sustainability gains, but we will also achieve better multimodality, because as other transport sectors electrify, for example, when aviation, even in a smaller scale, electrifies, we will be able to connect these industries in a totally new way. And we will build a more resilient industry again, because there might be another crisis coming up. eventually. And we have seen now how vulnerable the industry is to these fluctuations in the global community. And the technologies will open up for new entries, because I'm pretty sure that for example, electrical powered air taxis, we will see completely new entries, and they will open new markets and give aviation new opportunities. So these two or three technology paths will open up new markets and new possibilities, as long as our governments help us to achieve them. So there you have it. This is me. And if you want to contact me or follow me on any of the social medias, please feel free. And I'm very happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick, for this insightful discussion on the European market and how Europe is trying to regulate and make aviation more sustainable and environmentally compliant. Now back to India, we have with us Mr. Anish Michael, who, if I'm not wrong, is based out of Bangalore. And
Delhi, yeah.
Delhi, I'm sorry, based out of Delhi.
Yeah.
And Mr. Anish, it's now your floor. Please, we would look forward to your entire discussion.
I hope my screen is visible to all.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. A very good morning to everyone, and thank you for having me as a panelist at this International Legal and Policy Conference on the future of transport. Just a brief about myself. My name is Anish, and I work as a research associate with Ola Mobility Institute. We are a new age policy research think tank that work at the intersection of developing knowledge frameworks of mobility and public good. I particularly work in the urban mobility track, and that's where my reference point and my opinion on and remarks on this sector comes into play. Thank you, and thank you, Frederick, for providing us a broad overview of the international and the EU and the Swedish aviation sector frameworks. I will quickly, I would briefly be touching upon the Indian aviation sector and what we can expect in the future, the policies and initiatives that we can expect and that have been undertaken to decarbonize the whole sector, and further down, deep dive into the urban airspace that provides an immense opportunity for India and the world to chart its journey towards decarbonizing the aviation sector as a whole. Now, the pandemic has been a telling story for the aviation industry, and while contact-intensive services were hit, aviation sector was no different. However, for India, particularly since May 2021, once the restrictions were all lifted, the aviation sector started seeing its green shoots of recovery in the domestic sector. And even currently, with the onset of the new variant, and there are possibilities of lockdowns and restrictions. However, the rollback to peak COVID time seems rather unlikely, given how the aviation sector is pretty much a lifeline to the whole global economy. In this background, these recoveries and the growth potential only necessitates the need to move towards a more sustainable air transport. Decarbonizing the aviation sector for India becomes a very pertinent and an important policy objective. Various projections put India to be the world's third largest air transport market by 2030. And in this context, the National Civil Aviation Policy states as one of its mission to provide sustainable air travel. Currently, the aviation industry contributes to less than 1% of India's total emission. This might look like a small number. However, given the projections and the aviation being projected to be one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy, this comes at a cost where aviation's share of total emissions in India could increase significantly, and when these trends come into being. So a few of these initiatives that the government has been taken have been more holistic in nature, and decarbonizing this sector requires that holistic approach that goes beyond just focusing on the aircrafts. When we look at some of the initiatives, I'm just painting like a very broad picture of what the government has been undertaking. We look at how guidelines have been established to provide environmental steps to organizations to map and develop their carbon footprint. We're looking at adopting fuel efficiency methods. We're looking at even designs of aircrafts that improve efficiency to reduce emissions, and also route appropriation and selecting the appropriate aircraft for a particular route. While all of this does bring down the emission, but however, when you're talking about in the larger context of decarbonizing the sector, it requires a more concerted efforts and a more focused effort. As part of the government's National Action Plan for Climate Change, the National Biofuel Policy comes into play here, and it provides a roadmap for the use of agricultural and municipal solid wastes for blending. And this serves as a great potential for the production and the use of sustainable aviation fuels in India. And as mentioned by my previous panelists, how SAFs are being solely integrated into the aviation sector, and that for our medium and long haul flights would be the way forward going into a more sustainable future. And given the whole context of India's market size and its and the abundance of sustainable feedstock that we have, India could potentially be one of the leaders to build a roadmap to scale SAFs. SAFs have previously been tested in India, both in the civil and the military operations. However, it still requires a lot of scaling up and a concerted effort from all stakeholders to bring it up to scale. Right now, the targets look at blending about 5% to 10% of fuel by 2030. However, given the new NDCs that India is targeting, I think these will be scaled up in the future. Further, there are also operational and infrastructural measures that have been taken both from the private as well as the government sectors. We're looking at green airports, the likes of Delhi and Cochin. Kochi, for example, has been fully powered by solar. So it's not just aviation or when we talk about not just aircraft, but also ground infrastructure that contributes towards decarbonizing the whole sector as a whole. Further, we're looking at optimal utilization of runways and airspace capacities. Mumbai, for example, had optimized its runway time and airspace capacity that reduced fuel consumption to a very large extent. And all of this have aided in reducing emissions from all quarters. Now, this is more like at a national level. When we kind of look when we look into the future, and we break that down into the urban space, we move to the relevance of urban air mobility and its role that it could play in decarbonizing the sector and how important that becomes. As cities grow, urban population is set to grow manifold and requiring more innovative mobility solutions. Technology becomes a key enabler for climate action, and it becomes equally important to focus on developing viable alternatives and implementing environmentally sustainable practices. Scaled development, however, of fully electric aircraft, how you had also represented to that lovely table, that for electric propulsion, it would be more feasible for your short haul or just regional connectivity. But among the new technologies that are available for platforms in the industries, electric propulsion could be the first mover in helping achieve zero emission air travel. And it goes beyond just passenger and cargo delivery. And we're looking at more from a perspective of public safety. We're looking at humanitarian relief. We're also looking at infrastructure inspections and remote sensing, which all of it has up until now been done by fossil fuel based aircrafts. So that becomes an important aspect and a potential for electric propulsion and electric aircrafts and hybrid aircrafts to come into the picture. Now, when you talk about short haul flights and urban air mobility, a focus on this technology becomes more sustainable within the whole aerospace industry. And this is where Advantage India comes into being. The government, as part of its regional connectivity scheme, aims at enhancing connectivity to remote and regional areas of the country and making air travel more affordable. It is a key component of the Centre's National Civil Aviation Policy, which seeks to improve air connectivity to both Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities through revival of unused and underused airports. So from an infrastructural point of view, there is a base work and that's been laid. And currently, there are close to about 400 plus unserved airports and airstrips in the country. And going into the future, as we get more connected, air taxis and electric vehicles and electric aircrafts would be the preferable option to aid in the whole decarbonization of the sector. As a pretext to this, the Drone Rules 2021 that came into effect in the latter half of last year opens up the gateway for operationalizing air taxis in the future. However, they're not adrift of any challenges. Now, when you're talking about new technologies and scaling electric propulsion technology, it's all multifaceted, and it requires seamless collaboration from all stakeholders in the entire aerospace value chain. From a policy and regulatory perspective, we're looking at methods for allocation of airspace. That could be a challenge for scaling up UAMs. However, we see how countries across the globe are developing their unmanned traffic management systems. India has also come out with its own unmanned traffic management systems. So there has been a way forward. There has been a push towards and nudge towards bringing and seeing to fruition the urban air mobility. And when we're also talking about technology, which again becomes pertinent and important in this whole climate action plan, another aspect that could be thought of is the use of regulatory sandbox approaches that we could use. A lot of countries, especially UK, has been using the regulatory sandbox approach that looks to test and pilot innovations and technologies that lie in the policy gray area. But however, coming back to the whole electric airspace and the electric aircraft propulsion technologies, we require batteries that are light. We require batteries that are powerful, long-lasting, and also quick to charge. But achieving this would require the industry to work together. It cannot be done in silos. Similarly, when you're looking at investments to drive demand and build infrastructure, the companies need to work with the whole ecosystem, including government agencies and regulators. Industries need to partner with governments to develop the physical infrastructure. Like I mentioned, from a regional connectivity point of view, we have unused airstrips and airports that requires development, and that can be done without much of a hassle. Again, when you're talking about the long run, we're looking at scale of production and manufacturing of eVTOL aircrafts that would truly help in eliminating emissions. And the industry should be able to kind of to come up to the levels of reducing and meeting its targets. But however, going forward, formulating transport policies that cater to a sustainable future needs to be assessed from how much of emission reduction needs to be done and achieved based on the various scenarios, and rather than having, say, a one-size-fits-all policies. And that is where I think India also is working towards providing a more coherent and a collaborative effort towards sustainable aviation within the urban airspace as well as at the national level. So that I kind of leave it at that for further discussion. And thank you once again for giving me this opportunity, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Anish, for this wonderful presentation on the Indian aspect of sustainable aviation. Now, we have certain questions with which we'll begin. And the first question, which is my question, by the way, and it's open to all of you, is that, I mean, in Europe, all over the world, we have been talking about sustainable aviation fuel as the one important thing which can be done to reduce emissions from the aviation side. But it's also a fact that SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, is nearly 8 times costlier than the normal ATF which is used by the airlines these days. So my question would be, do you think this cost factor is the biggest impediment which the industry is facing in actually implementing this SAF as a normal fuel rather than ATF? Frederick, Anish, or you, whoever wants to answer this question.
Maybe I can go first, and then welcome other two panelists to build up. Just now you mentioned, yes, indeed, the cost issue is one of the biggest impediments now for the airlines to do this commercial scale up or the deployment of SAF, because the price you mentioned 8 times, but I think it's to be more accurate, it depends on the SAF's pathways and also the feedstock. So the cost can be 2 to 8 times. For example, those most available ones generate through HEFA, that's around 2 to 4 times. But those ones, if we look further to 2050, those power to liquid, that much more expensive, that can be mounted to 8 times indeed. And we think the most important thing to incentivize the SAF uptake, and also to for airlines to have this kind of commercial incentive to do that, is for government to actually having some policies. And we're talking about those smart policies which aim to bridge this price gap, and which also aim to normalize the investment to SAF. And currently, it's kind of interesting to observe 2 different approaches across the Atlantic. Just as Fred laid out, in European side, it's more about the SAF mandate, start from those Nordic countries like Sweden and Norway, and also the proposed approach in Refuel EU under EU Fit for 55 package. It's all about SAF mandate. But we're looking across Atlantic in the United States, it's more about incentivizing policies, such as offering the subsidies and also the tax credits. So you can see different approach. It's like kind of the stick on the European side and the carrot on the US side. So one of our industry's concerns of all this mandate is the big question mark. For example, under the Refuel EU, is to request 2% of SAF blending in 2025. So the question comes as whether at that time there will be enough supplies. And if there will be enough supplies, on which airports those supplies will be. So if we can't guarantee enough supply, what would happen is the market distortion. And this will be hurting most these hub carriers, whereby the mandate introduced, because those carriers will pay more. And also one important thing is about setting the scope right, because under the current Refuel EU proposal, all these international departures from the European airports will be subject to those mandates. So we're talking about the flight from Brussels to Delhi, and this flight will be subject to the SAF mandate, and that would also incur the question of extraterritoriality. So those are questions we're facing of the mandate approach. While on the US side, after those incentive measures be introduced, we see immediately the 7 billion US off-taking agreement of SAF has been signed between the airlines and the suppliers. And that's what we would like to see, to normalize and incentivize the investment from the stakeholder side. And that would ultimately help to achieve the purpose of bridging the gap and also normalize the investment. Okay, I'll leave my remarks here. Yeah, hope that helps.
Frederick, you have any point to add?
No, I generally agree with what was just said. I think the time has come for less stick and more carrot. I also believe that the price, well, what's the biggest problem we're facing right now? It's the price is a function of availability. So we need to increase production. We need to transform a complete, I mean, we're not the only ones in the aviation industry. We're not the only industry that needs sustainable aviation fuel for transitioning to a more sustainable transport system, but it's used for in other ways as well, for other transport modes, but also for other energy production. So we have to make sure that the total puzzle of all different energy sources works for us simply. We see in Europe now, for example, we have an increase, quite dramatic increase of electricity prices because of many reasons. But I think people are becoming more and more aware that production of energy needs to scale up if we're going to meet the future needs. And this is where we are running around and chasing our tail, certainly in Sweden, that we have these mandates now. We have a very clear position from the government to which direction the industry should walk. And we have also committed to walk that direction. Now we need to transform the system of energy supply. And this is nothing that the aviation industry can do alone. This is a national, or in Europe, a regional project that we have to get our hands around. And again, it's not only SAF, it's also electricity, it's other energy sources as well. So it's a real challenge. But if we're all committed and work together, we have to fix this one. Thank you.
Well, I guess you both mentioned about the demand supply aspect, but do you think at this stage the states can provide an interim subsidy? Do you think that's a way forward for the time being? The states giving subsidies to the airlines for using this fuel? Do you think that can be an ideal
I think,
or something which works for the time being?
I wouldn't exclude it, but I think what we should really use in that case taxpayers' money for is to increase the production. In various ways, we have to make sure that maybe through this risk sharing and to using different funds that we have in Europe, for example, and also from using ETS money, millions and billions of euros that are actually tripping into the system to expand the production capabilities and to advance the technologies. That's what I would rather see, because if we only subsidize, I think the speed of transition will be too slow. So I would say we need to do both.
Okay. Well, just to add that my background is in aircraft financing. So I just thought of adding, do you think that we can also see a model of green financing which is based on contingent financing, wherein the financier or the lessor can put a condition that if an airline is availing their loans or their money, they are bound to reduce their emissions by certain levels, or that the financier says that we'll only fund those aircraft which maintain or which adhere to a certain environmental emission levels. Do you think that's a possibility? Because even a few months back, if I'm not wrong, Germany saw its first green financing deal in an aircraft. So do you think that can be an option for the financing industry per se to step in?
Yeah, if you ask me, I think it's again a combination of different tools. We already have green financing in Sweden. For example, one of our member airlines, Bratens Regional Airlines, finance some of their new ATR aircraft with green financing. And I know that this is also a political initiative in the European Union. We have also something we call it's like the nomenclature for financing in Europe. And this big package looks at how can we through European legislation push investments to a greener direction. We are monitoring that quite intensively, because we want to see that all the technologies that we need in the aviation industry is included in that, the green technologies, which was not the case from the outset. But this is I mean, we're not calling the shots, but we are trying to persuade our leaders, our states, to include those. So I think, again, it's a combination of measures, and certainly money talks, we know that, and we should also persuade the financing to move in that direction.
And do you think what's the IATA stand on this?
Yeah, from IATA's point of view, I think it's important also to ensure that when evaluate all those environment performance of the aircraft, we apply the unified metrics, because we don't want different parties to adopt different metrics to evaluate aircraft environment performance. In that way, no matter we're talking about the regulatory measures or we're talking about those conditions for green financing, we think that will be causing the market distortions. So IATA is also working with our member airlines to develop all those unified methodologies to evaluate those performances. I think that would be important to emphasize as well. Yeah.
Okay.
I could also
yes.
Sorry.
Yes,
So
please.
maybe going back a bit to our earlier question on the subsidy, I just want to provide you a latest development and also empirical example whereby the UK Heathrow Airport has announced its subsidiary plans for those SAF uptake and airport from January 1st 2022. So for the airlines that uptake SAF and Heathrow Airport, 50% of the price of that SAF will be subsidized through the airport charges. So that would incentivize airlines to take SAF from there. Yeah, just one piece of follow-up information.
You adding something? Yeah. Frederick, you were
yes,
saying?
I just want to mention the European legislation which is being prepared. It's called the taxonomy legislation, and what we have to monitor very closely from not only aviation side but all industries is that we are not excluding possibilities, because of course if we create political instruments, legislation that pushes us in a certain direction, we might become like a racehorse, blind to what's happening in on the let's say a bit outside the focus areas. And I think it's very important to keep all options open. I could also add to what Zoe just said that we also in Sweden have a SAF, let's say, reduction of the fees, or rather a bonus. If you fuel up with more SAF, you get a certain bonus at some of the airports. But again, the volumes are so small. So what we have to focus on is to get the volumes up, and quite dramatically so.
Now we'll take certain questions from the audience. So the first question which we have is about flight shaming. I mean, that is something is we all believe that decarbonization of environment is a holistic task which has to be done by the entire sector, not just aviation, not land, but a combined holistic transport sector as such. But for all of you, Anish, Huey, and Frederick, do you think that aviation has been singled out a lot in this? And it is being, I mean, that's an audience question. They're asking that flight shaming. So, I mean, what is your take on that? Do you believe that aviation has been singled out a lot? Because, yeah, I mean, Frederick, you come from that land from which we have, yeah, please start with.
Maybe I should start, yes. No, but yes, I do, and I think aviation has been unfortunately then the target of not only flight shaming, but some kind of movement on looking at how we use resources, how we consume, and making us feel guilty about overdoing it, let's say, in a wider scale. But aviation was singled out clearly, and one problem I see there is, we're working with that almost every day to inform politicians, inform media, inform private citizens and companies that how much aviation of CO2 emissions aviation really contributes. And when they see the figures, it's not connected to the flight shaming feeling, let's say. And what the risk that I see is that we're focusing too much on the sectors that pollute quite small amounts, totally speaking. And that doesn't mean that aviation does not have an enormous job to do here in reducing its emissions. But the problem is that we're not looking at the sectors that are really polluting more, and that...
You're muted, Fred.
You're mute.
You're on mute.
I'm sorry for that. Yeah, so flight shaming and shaming as such is a bit of a, how can you say, a movement almost. So it's not only about flight shaming, it's meat shaming and energy shaming as such. Are we overusing? Are we over consuming? But I see a risk that if we focus on aviation, which I think has an undue burden in this, let's say, shaming movement, we risk to miss the target a bit, because we should also really focus on the sectors that really pollute so much more. And people have a feeling now, see from friends and families around me, that, well, if I just skip that long haul flight, I have done my part, on reducing my climate impact, which is not true. You have done something, but certainly missing maybe the bigger target, which is energy, for example, warming houses, and all of these other things that we also have to do. So, but I think that the consciousness of how we use our energies and that we should pollute more and create less effects on the environment is a sound movement. But we have to also be quite clever to understand where we can do the best for the future. And as we have discussed today, I think aviation has really a solid roadmap on how to do it for our industry.
So, you want to add something to this point?
Just, sorry.
Yeah, please, Manish, please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Just to add to what Fred had said, I think the focus has been on when we look at the larger context of how much emissions the aviation sector gives out, it's quite less compared to others. However, I still feel it becomes an opportunity for us in driving towards sustainability. I mean, it could, I mean, all of this shaming, flight shaming could be more like a blessing in disguise for us, as a lot of airlines, the aviation sectors, all these stakeholders, the industries, the OEMs are all taking efforts to move towards sustainability. The one downside for the aviation sector is that a move towards sustainability is more a long term than a short term. It's not a turnaround time of, say, a year or 2 years that you can kind of completely switch to, say, SAFs. It takes a while. So even for India, where we are talking about blending SAFs to about, say, even 5 to 10%, it requires heavy investments. And in that perspective, when all this all the shaming and everything happens, I think we need to see it from a more larger context, and how we are moving towards more sustainable modes. We are moving more towards sustainable methodologies with respect to the whole aviation sector. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, just thank you very much. Just a very quick one from my end. So speaking of flight shaming, my first reaction is CO2 is our problem, right? Flying is not our problem. So as just mentioned by the two other panelists, we're doing a very small portion, but this whole flight shaming's effect to us seems very undue and disproportionate to us. So having said that, apart from the fact the aviation industry have done a lot already, if you're looking at the fuel consumption in 1990s to today, we're saving already 50% of fuel consumptions. And also another point I want to emphasize is that apart from the aviation industry, our obligations, actually the passenger themselves, as the ones who actually fly, they also have options to help themselves to fly sustainably, right? Because you can engage with the airlines you're flying for all those voluntary carbon offsetting programs to ensure the leg you flying are actually carbon neutral. And also you can invest also on staff. For example, these programs offered by Lufthansa, and more airlines are following those examples and provide passengers themselves actually the options. And my key message here is everyone can contribute, and let's make us fly not ashamed, but fly proudly and sustainably. Yeah. Thank you.
The last question which we have, and I'm sorry for this and long question and answer session. I mean, many states, and to be very specific, European states are contemplating of imposing ban on short-haul flights. So do you think from a constitutional perspective, it is correct that you sort of limit the revenue area to a particular sector just because there's this mindset that the sector is contributing more towards environmental emissions? I mean, imposing a complete ban on short-haul flights is being contemplated in numerous states. So, I mean, what's your takes? It's a last question. So, I mean, I want your views on this, and then with this also the last point which you want to all of the audience to take back from this entire session, please. Frederick, you may start with that because again, it's a European thing which has come up.
Thanks. Yes. No, this is a discussion that we see in Europe, and I think it's also again a wrong focus. First of all, we should not look at only aviation when it comes to reducing transport emissions. We have to look at the whole sector. And the first question I have in my head: how are we going to replace that short-haul flight? Will it be replaced by, for example, cars? That might not be a better option. And certainly we don't have trains everywhere. But it's more than that. It's the wrong focus, because what you're actually doing then is you're taking away a very important market for the first generation of electrical aircraft. This is exactly the market that these aircraft will be able to provide excellent service in just a few years. And this would be a terrible action, I think, because what will happen is that many of these airports that are today served by short-haul aviation might not even survive if these short-haul bans are implemented. So what we're actually doing to do this, if we do this on a bigger scale, we might even delay the transition to sustainable aviation, and that I think would almost be some kind of crime as such. It will be a very, very bad action. Instead, focus on reducing the emissions horizontally, and also do not let these transport modes compete on emissions, but on efficiency instead.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I think I'll just to add to Fred's point as well, and what you had said earlier, the focus is not flying, but reducing carbon emissions. And even with these short-haul flights, like Fred had mentioned, it takes away an entire market for electric aircrafts to come into play and also decarbonize the sector as a whole. So even what are we looking at alternatives for India? Yes, rail connectivity and road connectivities are good, but at the same time, when we're looking at sustainable mobility and in the larger context, we're talking about, say, multimodality and intermodality. Taking away one sector away from this whole gambit of transport, I think would be detrimental towards our sustainable mobility future. So I think, yes, this whole, thankfully, we don't have a ban here in India on short-haul flights, but I think it provides an equally good market as we go forward in the next 3-4 years or 3-5 years, where electric air taxis could play a significant role. And given the government's whole regional connectivity scheme, I think it's a potential market to towards more sustainable future in the aviation sector.
Anish, we have one question for you. I'm sorry I'm asking this, it's from the audience. It says that, do you think that these electric vehicles which are coming, are they 100% pollution free? Because the batteries they use and the charging point they use, what's your thought on that?
Yes, so in the larger context, as we move more towards the future, yes, the drive should be towards a complete green mobility. Yes, at the initial stages, when you're talking about batteries, we're talking about technologies. We cannot particularly say that they would be completely green. But however, given the context of, or comparing on a comparative scale vis-a-vis your fossil fuel, I think they're a better alternative moving forward. But in the larger context, and as we move further down the line, we're looking at a 10-year, 15-year timeline. I think, yes, we would probably be coming to a complete green technology, right from the raw material right towards the final product. So yeah.
So with this, we have rather saved our time. I thought we'll cross the time limit, but somehow we have saved 15 minutes. So I must say we are more sustainable and more efficient. So, any points you want to add, anybody? And Sagar sir has joined.
No, I'm here, but probably one question I would add to the panelists, or at least ask the panelists, is to reflect on what 2022 holds for the sector, especially in light of all these movements that we see, and whether it's shaming or the, I think what we need to also reflect on is what kind of policies or regulatory mechanisms and maybe some kind of access to fundings that probably is another big area that we need to we haven't touched on, but at least the area that we need to reflect on. So there are a number of aspects, but maybe just one of those crystal ball questions where you take stock of what 2022 or what changes we could expect in the sector. But at the end of the day, sustainability is a responsibility of each and every individual. Okay, so as a sector, what is it that we are trying to do that will probably also be that customer centric, the other way around as well? So I just put a question, but also some remarks there, but it's for you to reflect, what really from your standpoint because the theme of our conference is fall or rise of the transport sector. But again, there are so many things that we need to do. And if we don't get it right, probably it's going to fall. But that's not how I would put it, like in a very negative way. I think we have seen COVID, which is worst hopefully in our lifetime. So I'm sure it's only upward journey for us. But I leave there maybe for your reflection or any other remarks on that question. Maybe Anish, we start from you with the Indian perspective, probably, and then we'll end with you.
Yeah. Sure. I think for 2022, with our whole question of the fall and rise of the aviation, I would still say that it's just the rise. Just going by numbers, if you look at the whole last year, from January up until say October, November, the domestic airline capacity has increased by almost 25-26% from the 2020 base. Yes, the COVID year cannot be like a benchmark, but however, the whole recovery aspect going into 2022, we see how we've almost reached that whole 90% of recovery to the pre-COVID levels. So yes, in terms of what the sector holds, it's quite bright, but also provides us an opportunity when we again reflect that with respect to fuel consumption. Yes, from I think the projection from April last year to the coming financial year is going to go up by 50%. And all of this kind of circles down to how we kind of want to build on sustainable aviation, even with our targets of reducing 1 billion tons of carbon emissions by 2030 and minimizing carbon intensity by 45% by 2030. I think it provides an opportunity, and the start begins right now. Yes, we put our COVID years behind, and moving forward, I think the focus should be on the efforts that have been continuously going on. Yeah, so I'd leave it at that.
Thank you. I'll have a quick comment as well.
Okay,
This for last question in 2022. I think from the factual level, because of COVID, we're still struggling, and the traffic volume are still falling from the pre-COVID level. So that's still falling. But I see the industry's ambition of dealing with climate change and rise. So I'm very optimistic of that. And I quite agree with what Anish just said. Always those kind of crises associate with opportunities. And what I'm saying that is, in looking forward in 2022, ICAO Assembly next year in October will be discussing on the country's level a long-term aspirational goal for the aviation. And we believe if that kind of agreement can be somehow achieved, that would better unlock the potentials of different stakeholders that better working together collectively help industry achieve this net zero 2050 goal. And that unlock ambition is both from the political level, and that will be associating with all those financial investment as well. So I'm quite optimistic on that regard. Thank you.
And I agree as well. I would want to see 22 to be less shaming and more faming those initiatives that actually are important. I would like to see a direction in the politics in Sweden, in Europe, and also global, let's say, for the ICAO Assembly, where we really focus on the target, which is to reduce the emissions and not the industry, the transport capabilities as such. Because one thing is for sure, that the request for transport will not decrease in the future, it will increase. So we and all the other transport modes will have to find the way to offer the transport, or make the transport offer to everyone, to businesses, to persons, fossil free, or best case zero emissions. And there's really not any other way. And I think we should also not be shy in aviation to, of course, be proud of what we have achieved, but also look at the possibilities now, as was discussed in this very excellent panel, I think. Look at the possibilities, the new technologies that we see just around the corner, actually, if we look at it from a perspective of the 1903 Brother Wright flight at Kitty Hawk. Now, within 10, 15 years, we have a lot of interesting things going on for the aviation industry. And my take on this, because we have a global certification system, or at least global certification rules, and we have ICAO as a fantastic tool, that maybe we could even be faster than other sectors in decarbonizing, because we can push out these technologies much quicker than many of the other sectors. So I am very optimistic, but we also need the public and the politicians to be optimistic. So let's work on that.
Thank you, Fred. I think, yeah, I mean, there's so many questions, but it's a very technical subject even to understand for many of us. But still, it's a subject that we have to deal with, because the importance or the relevance of this particular issue, with the climate issue, is getting more and more, and the link to transport is only, yeah, I only see the shaming and the noise getting louder. So I think we all have to work together, and that cross collaboration. I think for me, one of the key things is the fact that someone like you, Fred, and you come from the industry, and someone like Anish, who's coming from, a think tank. I mean, there has to be a lot of collaboration, even with the law school or with some other policymakers, experts, like, I think we should all be sitting together, because this is one thing that we are missing still. Even though we see that a lot of efforts are being done and a lot of efforts are taking place, but that cross collaboration is missing, and probably that's also the reason why it's so difficult to understand this subject. So I hope, the listeners or the participants here got a glimpse of what this subject is, and I hope it's helpful for them, and probably some of them will take it forward as well, along with you, the panelists here. And we thank each of you for taking the time. I know it's a holiday period in Europe, and really a big thank you, and to each of you for participating and for sharing your views.
A pleasure.
Thank you, Sagar. Thank you for wonderful conducting again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So our next session is at, thank you, Fred. Thank you. Our next session starts at, thank you, Anish, at 2 o'clock. So there's a lunch break now, and our next session is going to be on the logistics and supply chain panel. So see you at 2 o'clock, and have a good lunch break.